Well, thank you, Herm, so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate you all coming out after a long lunch, for this hopefully conversation that we're going to have. I'd like to first salute Chaplain Kaiser here, because he has been truly a singular and most helpful leader for the Army, for our country, for several decades, and have the deepest respect for working with him and what he's continued to do. I think that for you all who know him and work with him, and you would understand that Herm brought to the Army into the chaplaincy a very rare but extremely vital quality, care of both his professional life and his personal life, which is he had courage, and he had the courage to speak truth to power. And that is so important for many of us who are in the helping professions, as clinicians, as a physician, psychiatrist, as chaplains, and for the lawyers as well, because our Army, our country, thrives when people are willing to speak their mind about what they believe is right. And you have to do that at times. And Herm was by far the beacon for us doing that. And those of us who worked with him, and those of us who had the pleasure to learn from him, the privilege to learn from him, followed his example. And that's so important. And I find that today as well in my work. I continue to be able to work with a lot of soldiers and veterans and others. And it just comes a time that you have to say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it, and it's the right thing to do. So I salute you, Herm, again, and I appreciate being invited here and to spend the afternoon with you. Now, I know it's lunchtime, so you don't need to listen to me for an hour and a half. I mean, we've set an hour and a half here, but what I'm going to do, and I hope I don't mess up the cameras, is I really want you to interrupt me as we go through and you say, look, I don't understand that. Or here's something I see, I think about it. Just raise your hand, and if we need to repeat the question, I will repeat it, and we'll get into a conversation, because we're going to learn here today. We're all going to learn together about what this dimension is, what this part is of the lives of the young men and women who over the past 12 years have been defending our country in Iraq and Afghanistan and across the world. This is the soldiers who've carried their packs now, often 90 pounds plus or minus, up and down the hills of Afghanistan and through the desert of Iraq. And many of them have had many, many tours. It's a volunteer force. 1%, only 1% of our population is served. And that's a huge difference from Vietnam when we came in, and many of you perhaps are veterans of Vietnam. And clearly my father was a career Air Force officer, actually started Army Air Corps. So World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I mean, there were more Americans who participated and were part of the military. It was really much more closely knit into the fabric of our nation. But now only 1% have served. That's important. The war, in the nature of the fighting, changed significantly over these past 10 years. And I want to start with that, so as those of you who I gather, many of you are counselors, clinicians, as well as in the ministry, begin to grasp what the change is in that fighting. First issue is many people deployed many times. The cycle was to come in, a young enlisted soldier would come in, they'd have basic training, AIT, sometimes it was compressed, they'd get to a unit, like the 101st, they'd be there 6 or 9 months, they would deploy. They'd be a year in theater, they would come back, they'd have 30 days off completely, dispersed. If they were in the Guard, they would be going back to their homes. If they're active, they would then come back to the installations. They'd have a next 30 to 60 days about half time, and then they'd start, by the 4th month, they'd start training up again for the next deployment. So that after about a year on station, they would be getting ready, or they'd be in theater again for another 12 months. In 07, 08, I guess maybe late 06, as the surge was being geared up, many of those soldiers stayed in, not for, I'm talking mostly Army here, stayed in theater not for 12 months, but for 15 months. And that, interestingly, all put a special stress on that group of people. They come back, the cycle would start over. We've had any number of young men and women who have deployed 3, 4, 5 times to the combat theater. All different jobs, all different scenarios. That was Vietnam. There are certainly soldiers who had 2, 3 tours. I don't know how many tours you had. But when I talk to my colleagues, they feel it differently than what this cycle was like. This put a special stress on these young men and women. So that's point one. People will ask, well, what's different about this? Why is this group different? Why is this group affected? Well, because it is different. Their lives were different. The fighting was different. The fighting was particularly different. It's what I'm going to try and introduce you to because of the IED blast, the improvised explosive device. This was a game changer. It was the weapon, the new weapon of this war. It exerted what we're going to go talk about. It really affected, it impacted the soldiers with concussions. And it took us probably 10 years into the war to acknowledge what the effect was of these blasts on the brains of these young men and women. When we started off in 2002, 2003, and we were seeing the first casualties, in fact, I remember walking the halls of Walter Reed in 2004. My father had had a stroke. I was there with him before he passed. I spent every day there. And the first group of soldiers was coming through. And the neurology ward was right next to the orthopedic ward. And I'd see these young men, double amputees. I mean, a blast would go off and it would shred their legs. Very different injury than we got in Vietnam. And I realized, I'd talk to them, they just couldn't focus. They couldn't carry on a conversation. And so we chat. Anybody check that out? No, sir. What do they tell you about? Are you having, what's going on? I have headaches, I can't sleep. We're worried about my legs. In 2003, 2004, we didn't talk about concussions. The NFL, or the NHL, I mean, you all might be hockey fans up here, so they weren't a problem. If you talk to the neurologists, well, everybody gets better. 90% of the people who've had concussions get better. We don't have to worry about it. But when you start to talk to these young folks, you realize something was different. They weren't better. Something had changed. But we were in denial. Our army was in denial. Our country was in denial. Our sports industry was in active denial. It was business. So that's changed, the IED blast. And we're going to focus most of the time so that when you meet soldiers, you start trying to explore with them what happened and how many IEDs they were exposed to. But here's the third element that I'm going to want to talk to you about. And it's all part of this. I'm not a professional PowerPoint ranger, so this is just a simple slide. But what I'm going to try and explore to you is some visual of when you sit down with a young man or woman who's a veteran, and you're trying to grasp what's going on in their lives, how you begin to dive into these various parts of their lives. So the third piece that's going to affect, I think, in a way, the spiritual and the environmental was what was expected of these young men and women. How many of you have heard of the coin doctrine? You know what coin is? The counterinsurgency. So what's the theme of counterinsurgency?
Hardened minds.
Hardened minds. What that meant was Private Smith one day was going to be on a mission going down a trail that might have IEDs, looking for Taliban who are enemy, had either he'd been told about before he went on the patrol, or had learned to identify, and his job was to take them out. That was on Tuesday. On Thursday, he and his commander and his squad leader were going to go into that village where they, a couple days ago, might have had an enemy, and they were going to sit down with the village leaders and talk to them about what they needed to make their life better in the village. Seems pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Except if you're 20 years old. Now I want you to think about it. And there was within the Army a serious debate about was this was the doctrine that General Petraeus, who I have the highest respect for, I served with for many years, was the godfather of, was the coin doctrine. There was another school of thought that said you can't realistically do that. Maybe you can at 50 or 60, or if you're a senior colonel or a general, you can switch back and forth. But at 20, 25, I just read a doctorate thesis of a sociology candidate, PhD candidate from Yale, who went and interviewed lieutenants and captains for several years. And these lieutenants and captains said, we couldn't make the switch. Or if we did make the switch, imagine, put yourself back in the situation of being 20 years old. Imagine how you make that switch. You go from this role to this role. You're sitting at the Sheriff Council. It's very strict. So in concept, in abstract, it makes sense. In reality, particularly to young people, it's hard to do. And then imagine, when you add to it the kinds of things that have happened, then imagine if, by accident, just because of the fog of war, you shoot a 10-year-old. You shoot a mother. It happens a lot. So then, how do you start to wrestle in your mind, spiritually, mentally? How do you wrestle trying to make sense of that? This is real. Now, having said that, there are lots of folks that can do that. There are lots of folks that have the capacity to make those shifts in their lives. They're talented, they're energetic, they're smart, they do well. But you know, there's lots of folks that don't. And those of us in the helping professions see the people that can't make the shifts. It's wrong. What I hear from senior leadership is, you know, that guy wasn't resilient enough, right? We blame the victim. We blame the patient. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to help those people. Because there's as many of those people as that there are people who are going to become generals, colonels, and generals. It's not my job to judge them. It's my job to recognize who they are and what they came to the party with, what they came to the mission and to the Army with, and what they can do. Here's what I'm telling you. I just helped with a case of a 29-year-old former sergeant who was sexually abused 3 times from the time he was 3, 11, and 15, who had no clue what to do with it, caring family. They sort of knew it, sort of didn't know it, had no idea what to do, who started to drink some in high school because what do young people do? I mean, what medicine is out there? Alcohol and marijuana. I mean, that's what they do to take care of themselves. And then said, if I'm going to make something, I'm going to get over it, I'm going to join the Army. So he joins the Army. And finds himself, he joins in, I guess he's a little bit older now, he joins in about 04, 05. And what happens during training? He has a squad leader who's just come back, who hates the Iraqis, and he's going to toughen up his soldiers, and he shows them repeatedly over and over again beheadings of Nicholas Berg. Remember that? So you're going to take a young kid, just in the Army, you're going to train him to win the hearts and minds, by first showing him beheadings. But he's going to be a good soldier, learns his craft, ready to go, goes over there, fighting, and the IED blast hit him, and we're going to talk about how that diminishes your capacity to be able to do this kind of thing. And then they're in a firefight, and a young girl gets killed. And he says something's not right, but he doesn't understand. He isn't, and no one is there to help him make sense of this. Here's a guy who's a victim, right? He was sexually abused. And somewhere in his psychology is a sense that abusing, victimizing a young child is not the right thing. But he comes back, has his interim tour, he's still got time to enlist, he's still got time on his enlistment, goes back, in fact ends up in a situation where they're attacked, huge amount of firefighting, he's wounded some, and he realizes he can get an early out. And what we call pencil whips, I mean, just goes through his phone work and he's out. What happens when he gets back? He gets really, just dives down into bad alcohol, and his life just spirals down. And in a drunken state that he doesn't really remember, he rapes a woman. So, perpetrators do what happened to them. He knows it's wrong now. He's sober. Never got treatment. Hardly understood. Really, about 2 years, he just got sentenced to 37 years for his crime. 2 years, he was about to tie a noose around his neck in jail, and he was found, and he said, "This is all wrong. Something is terribly, terribly wrong," and has been trying now since that time to straighten his life out. I have a second case of a young man who may face about 15 years, who was 98th out of 99 in his high school class, failed his physical initially because he had a concussion, managed at a time when he was brought in, was a combat engineer, which means his job was to go find IEDs, 17 blasts. He's deaf now almost, can't walk. I'll show you some of the symptoms. Probably got caught up in a sting. And he can't comprehend what's happened to him. Now, these are extreme cases. I mean, these are people that are facing a lot of prison time. But there's lots of other folks out there that are also struggling. They can't find work, and they can't make their relationships go. They can't keep an intimate relationship. They lose control with their kids. They barely can go to school. So this is a different war. These men and women have had a different experience. And we are now learning, just like the generations of people before us. It's the practice. They call it the practice of medicine for a very good reason. You practice. You learn with every patient. And so now we're on a different learning curve. And I want to bring to you today what particularly the blast injury piece does on that learning curve. Now, for many people who have had concussions, and so a concussion is any injury to the head that in one way or another could cause a bruise or an injury to the nerves in the brain. There are these kinds of physical problems that will often happen usually immediately afterwards. So after a person's have had a concussion, they've hit their head really hard, they'll often have headaches, and they'll have headaches for a long time. So we've got these patients who have had concussions and not recovered. One of the symptoms that seems to really persist are the headaches. So I know it's after lunchtime, but I want to kind of give you all a bit of a concussion. I want you to think about what the symptoms are after lunch, and you're feeling a little bit sleepy, and you might want to be, doing something else, and you're having a little difficulty paying attention. You're not sure you're tracking what this guy's saying on the stage. Imagine being in that phase all the time. Remember how you feel for a moment. Remember how you feel when you're tired and you're trying to learn something. You're trying to grasp it. And you say, yeah, I know it, but I don't get it. It's that get quality that is lost with concussions. We call it abstraction. And when the brain has been injured, and I'll show you some other slides about how that physiologically and metabolically affects it, the brain is working at 70–80%, like you're sleepy. So you can't concentrate. You can't quite make connections, associations. It's really hard to learn. If you've got a headache, and you have a headache every day because you have a concussion, imagine how frustrated you feel. Imagine how irritable you can get, how over time your mood gets depressed. And these people who have had many, many blasts or impact concussions have chronic headaches. And what do we give for headaches? Well, when they're really bad, we give narcotics, right? So what do the narcotic medications do? Make you sleepy, right? So here you are, you're having problems already because you've got a concussion. And now I'm going to treat you with medications that's going to make you sleepier. And I'm going to make it more difficult for you to concentrate and pay attention. And the spiral starts. On psychological testing, what we see is problems of the speed of processing. That is how fast, how quick people think. Here's the point that when it comes to counseling, I think is really important, and it's the reasoning and the judgment. And it's what the Army likes to think of about character, about moral behavior. is if you can follow some rules, you know what the rules are, and you're going to follow those rules, and if you break those rules, we're going to court-martial you. Unless, of course, you're a particular rank and you got a particular friend, and maybe we won't court-martial you, and, you know, maybe we'll just court-martial you a little bit, or we'll cut a deal, all that kind of thing. But if you can't think, if you've got headaches, if you're irritable, if your mood's down, and you're an Army guy, means you're action-oriented, you're trained to be action-oriented, you're trained to, if you got a problem, to take it on, what are you going to do? You're going to act in a way that's probably going to get you into trouble. It's not simple. Sometimes that you'll see, and you might notice it, I don't know how you do your counseling. I kind of like, I watch my patients sort of walk in and out of my consultation room. They have a little bit of a shuffle. Remember Muhammad Ali? You know Muhammad. So, right, he was an old boxer. So he has what we would, you know, the old boxer's brain injury. And the football players, Dorset now has the long-time consequences, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. They have a Parkinsonian-like problem, sort of a slight wider base gait, a little shorter steps. You can see that in a very faint way. In only extreme cases do we see blurred vision. So I want you to get a feeling now of what is the state of mind of a young person, had multiple deployments, exposed to IED blasts, and living with what the consequences of those many, many concussions are. Now here's part of the problem in medicine, which is that the symptoms we're talking about all overlap. You know, in medicine, I don't know about your experience, my experience is the treatment you get for your problem really depends on the door you walk through. Right? So if I got a GI problem and I see the gastroenterologist, I'm going to get a pill. If I go see the surgeon, you know, who knows what's going to happen. So avoid surgeons. But, you know, if you got a hammer, everything's a nail. And so the psychiatrists will all diagnose PTSD, God bless them. And then the primary care anesthesiologist will talk about the pain. And there'll be some of the orthopedic surgeons will talk about the pain. But the fact is that everybody's got everything. You can't sort of, this is almost an artificial separation of these things. It's really unrealistic. The people that we see every day have all that stuff and more. They got sleep problems. I didn't talk about is how the sleep cycle gets reversed. And both in training, they have huge sleep problems coming back. And the psychiatrists say, well, your sleep problems are because you've got PTSD. But you know, sleep problems are sort of a problem on their own. Ask any woman after she's had her first baby, right? How many, I was shocked. I thought I was a pretty smart doctor after my wife had our first baby. And she says, you know, I just can't sleep the same way. What's the problem? You know, I was a resident. You know, I was a fellow. I stayed up every third night. She says, I think you're different. And I said, oh, that's probably true. But I'll show you some stuff. Sleep's a very complicated in of its own. And we did some work years ago about sleep discipline, sleep training. Well, on its own, it's a separate kind of problem. So the fact is, these ideas, these diagnoses that we have, they sort of inform you about what's going on, but look, they're just working hypotheses. What's important is what's the person like that you're talking to. So just so you've got some sense of what these brain injuries are and how they occur, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And let me tell you, I know that when you say brain, you think neurosurgeons, super specialists. What I'm talking about today is in your wheelhouse. What I'm talking about is everyday things that should be right there in the community, on the front lines. They should be something you're thinking about. It really isn't brain surgery. It really isn't rocket science. It's basic stuff that we now start to routinely think about as we're working with our patients. But the brain is just fascinating. I mean, look, it's 3 pounds. It's not that big. It has 100 billion neurons. That's incredible. It's incredible. In that space, it is so complex with electrical, chemical, biological properties. We're just beginning to decipher how it really works. I mean, it is an amazing supercomputer that's got, different wiring. This brain, 3-pound brain, in a 160-pound man, uses 20% of all the oxygen. Really? Now, what if you get a little sick, or you're having a bit of a cardiac problem, and your body, your brain says, we got to send a little more oxygen and energy to there, and you take it from the brain? Are you not going to feel the effects? How foggy do you feel foggy when you've got a cold or an illness, not only perhaps because the microbes also in your brain tissue, but also because the rest of your body is requiring more oxygen and more glucose. Here's one of the interesting, it is really, the skull is an amazingly protective casing. For the jello-like structure that the brain is, when you open up a brain, I suggest you do that when you go home, but when you open up a brain, you'll see that it's not like other parts of the body. It's really this jello-like structure, and it's it is just wonderful. I mean, nature is just amazing. I learned when I went to medical school and the dinosaurs roamed that whatever was programmed at age 5 wasn't going to change. That's not true. But you know what we say in medicine? When we see young med students, look, 50% of everything we're going to tell you today is you're going to find out in 10 years is wrong. We just don't know which 50%. Not very reassuring when you... So I suggest you see a couple of doctors before you decide to let one cut on your brain. So we'd like to think that the brain is color-coded and tagged. It's not. And not as any other part of your body. When you do surgery, and I loved it, I almost became a surgeon, you realize it's a little bit in the old days before GPS, and you're kind of going down the road and you say, this road doesn't look, remember when we had map reading courses, this road doesn't look like the road I was supposed to be on. You're right, it's not. And, but that's how but this part of the brain is what the frontal, is what makes us different. The frontal lobes, where all this executive processing goes on, right up here, distinguishes us from every other mammalian species, including all the apes, great apes. It is 70% larger than any other species. So that's what makes us different. And that's where all these subtle things happen. That's where all these little changes occur and enable us to do things, have language, and learn, and exercise reason, and exercise judgment, and pay attention, and do algebra, and compose music. That's where all that occurs. And it doesn't take much to diminish the capacity for that. Now, just to impress upon you what an amazing structure this is, these are really they're special micrography of these small, small blood vessels. Look at these blood vessels. 100 billion neurons. Everyone needs blood and nutrients. How does it get there to the neurons? And it's this, look what beautiful the architecture is here. Now, can you imagine, if you were playing football against some 300-pound lineman, can you imagine putting your head down and running and hitting that wall as hard as you could? What it would do to these blood vessels? Can you imagine if over there a equivalent of a mortar, IED blast, that could put out, 50-pound explosive occurred, and the shock wave went through your head, what it would do to these small blood vessels? Imagine. Because right now in science we don't know. That's what's most confounding, and why it becomes important to listen and ask about what's happening in these lives of these men and women, because in fact we really don't know. We don't understand either right when, because how are you going to understand? It's hard to do it in humans, and you can only kill so many mice. Right? And it's all done on mice and rats, all these experiments. You can only, millions of mice and rats have given their lives to figure this out. And then it's just not the same, because their skulls aren't the same and their brains aren't the same. So this is really hard to figure out and appreciate. And I think it's important to have some healthy skepticism about it as we start to consider. So that was the slide before, was about the biological properties because of the circulation. These are the chemical properties. These, in the 80s, when the Prozac generation got really going and everybody was excited, people said, well, look, we've figured it all out. There's this little neurotransmitter here, and if you get Prozac, it'll kick this dopamine transporter, and you'll have more of the chemical that crosses the synapse, and you'll feel better. It's great marketing by the pharmaceutical companies. It's brilliant marketing. In fact, it's not that simple. The chemistry of the brain is extremely complex. We only know bits and pieces here and there, and there's just not that kind of industrial engineering model that's been out in the lay press for years about what's happening. Take something you take for granted every day, fall asleep. Now just for a moment, ask yourself, do you know how that happens? Do you understand how that happens? Why does it happen sometime and doesn't happen another time? How important is sleep? You know, restorative sleep may be the golden road to lots of things. I mean, one of the interesting little studies done last year that came out is that during restorative sleep, when these neurons put out little waste products, somehow or other, if you get a good 6-8 hours sleep a night, those waste products are flushed out and your brain works better. Sleep. So when you're talking to these people, ask them, like that guy right there, he's sleeping. But, so lights go down, turns on the center here. There's a literally like a little clock that we talk about in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the brain, pineal, and then it goes through, and finally your whole system starts to go to sleep, right? Your legs feel relaxed. You know, your muscles relax. You breathe differently. Your heart rate goes down. It's magic. It's just magic. Now, the other myth that people are going to talk about about who's got PTSD and who's vulnerable to traumatic brain injury and who might be depressed are genes. Right? We all learned about the P's and Mendelian genetics in high school and all that. It is not that simple. On a good day, for serious mental illness like schizophrenia, genetic differences explain 4% of the causation. So whatever people are reading about and understand, well, why is this soldier vulnerable? Why is that one didn't get it? Well, maybe there's something genetic. Well, it's a good research proposal. I hope they get the grant money, all that kind of stuff. All right, so what do you need to do? There are some tests. Let me just go back, actually, because I want to go back to this. Now that I've explained to you what this means about the brain and how delicate it is and how complicated the functioning is and how easy it is to affect the thinking, the reasoning, and the judgment, what does it mean about a young person's spirituality and what some people call the moral impact and injury to them? How does it affect their capacity to try and make sense of why this girl was killed because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time and their daughter is okay at home? And how does it make sense to understand why this dad, who can barely eke out a living, the plot of land that he has in his village, will do what he has to do to save and keep his family healthy and thriving, and we think that he's a threat and he needs to be taken out? When you know that when you go back home, there are people that are doing the same thing. And understand that this complicated brain is all these factors are at play. And further aggravated now by what is the classic way that young people handle their problems, which is drugs and alcohol. That's right. And it's the worst. Right? If you're already having problems thinking, if you already have some headaches, if you're already depressed, the last thing you should do is drink a six-pack in an evening. But it's what's there. It's what they think is going to help. It's what they know.
So it mirrors our culture, though, right? It's sort of what we're going to give you drugs to help with it.
We'll give you drugs to help, exactly.
I'm going to do it myself instead.
I'm going to do that. And I'll smoke cigarettes, and I'll take, I mean, the hash actually in Afghanistan, the amount of hash that has gone unreported is, to me also, very, very impressive. So just to let you know a little bit as you're talking to your patients or clients, whoever you do. Sir?
What do you mean by the hash that goes unreported?
I don't think there's been, I've not seen many, when I've interviewed soldiers, now the window is I've interviewed soldiers who are in trouble, is I've done a couple cases of soldiers who were on FOBs in Afghanistan, and they would say at least 40% of E4s and below, that is below the level, below the rank of sergeant, were smoking hash. And they're getting hash from their translators.
Okay, well, what you remind is that there's a report recently that the copy cultivation was considerably higher in Afghanistan now than it was 10 years ago or whatever. And of course there's, more publicity about the heroin problem here in the United States too. And the CIA and its FreeSurfers were involved in globalizing the drug trade from Asia, even prior to World War II. And back in the 60s, the New York Times and other sources were reporting how that was distributed to various communities to destabilize them, as a counterintelligence and forward operation technique. And so your mention of it, that's right.
Yeah, no, unlike Vietnam, where we had problems with heroin and narcotics and opiates, I don't see a problem in this population because of even with the availability of the poppy. At least I've not heard of that, and I've not seen any information to say that. The problems that I see in this population are hash and actually iatrogenically addiction to opiates, particularly OxyContin. I see a lot of problems, these young soldiers who've come back with these pain problems, particularly they'll have orthopedic injuries, and they're mostly orthopedic. Sometimes because of headaches, their doctors will get them on these opiate prescriptions, and they'll get really almost by the time that they get to a level and they're really essentially addicted to OxyContin. And it's really incredibly addictive. And nothing being done to, I think, get them off the OxyContin and to have other ways to deal with their pain problems. So, brain injury, problem with judgment, problem with concentration, problem with thinking, they've got pain, they can't sleep, they get narcotics, they don't know how to take alternatives and do alternatives to get off the narcotics. They got more pain every time they get off of it. If you say, well, exercise, lose weight, but I can't, I've got pain. I mean, their lives just start in this circle. And in our challenge as clinicians is to unpack that. Sir, ma'am.
Without them saying that they're not treatment compliant.
Right.
Because that's what I hear a lot.
Right. So, right. And so they get blamed, they're not treatment compliant, all that kind of thing. I agree with you. They'll be, and they won't, yet when I've reviewed those cases, I don't see where they really offered an alternative, and an alternative that appreciated how tough it was for them to make the shift. You know, one of my own opinion about this, and you all can argue with me, is, you know, when I started in this field 40 years ago, and alcohol was a big problem, although I was coming from inner city hospitals and did my residency, and we did have problems with opiates. We at least had the option of long-term treatment for rehab. I mean, you could put somebody in a place for 6 months. Out there in Baltimore where I went to med school, we had the Parapoint VA. They had a 6-month program, and you could park them there for 6 months, and they would go through all these shifts, and they'd, you know, and one counselor called them not treatment compliant, but they had the 6 months to detox and get themselves straightened out, and they needed that. We don't have that anymore. And these young people go into the clinics, and they're, you know, they'll come in with a problem, and they'll be told, well, here's your prescription, follow it. And if they don't follow it, they're not treatment compliant, then they'll end up in the legal system. That's wrong. And that's just wrong. And it's wrong that they've had a brain injury because they don't understand. You're expecting them to be able to figure out on their own every day something different about how they're supposed to take care of their pain and sleep and anxiety and irritability and relationships. Their brains aren't able to do that, even if it's not a clearly obvious injury. Down deep inside. What this tells you, this software, I love it, FreeSurfer, is probably some ex-LSD guy who wrote the program. Right? So these are all more or less research tools. When we try to take them to court cases, the judges will often, there's a thing called the Daubert rule that you have to use. You have to prove that it's scientifically valid. And they'll say, well, you know, there's not enough science to prove it. All right. So it happens to your son. But what this does is this does sophisticated analysis of the various pixels of the brain. You take an MRI, and then you do an analysis pixel by pixel of the volume of where you think a particular area of the brain, and you compare that area of the brain to what is so-called normal. And you'll see differences. And you'll see them particularly in this area here that we call the prefrontal cortex, because that's where all the... Sir?
Yeah, I just, back to the talking about, you know, being on oxycodone and all of these symptoms, and, you know, you seem to be nailing everything on the head, but what about the soldier? Like, okay, for instance, most potent medication they're given is tramadol, but they're still experiencing severe chronic breakthrough pain in their back or lower back or any area of their body due to traumatic injury or just the stress of carrying the 85-pound rucksack you showed earlier. And the clinician can say, okay, well, I'm not giving them Percocet, Vicodin, or oxycodone because, you know, I don't want to be responsible for that. So aren't they obligated, though, legally to treat the symptoms of their patient and be looking out for the best interest of their patient if they're experiencing severe chronic breakthrough pain, even though they're taking, you know, mid-level pain medication?
No, absolutely. I'm not, I think that we are absolutely obligated to treat our symptoms and the pains, and particularly the pain, because I think the pain has, in so many ways, affects the individual's life. The challenge is, let me just put it, is to treat the patient, not just the pain. You know, we've all had injuries, you know, broken a vertebrae or broken a leg, and we have pain. There's no magic, and I'm not going to be a hard ass, excuse me, about it, but I do pretend to have been a retired general. So I'm here to make sure that the best thing is done for you. That you can work, you can have good family relationships, you can enjoy yourself. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to be able to do about your pain, except to put the treatment that I think is the smartest for you so that you can do everything else that you need to do in your life. And to treat your pain, which is really treating you, is more than giving you narcotics.
I agree with that.
Right? There's a whole universe of so-called alternative, which I don't think are alternatives. A whole universe of treatments that should be made available to you, you should be instructed on, you should be supported on, so you learn to live and minimize your pain, and you're at the optimal level of function. That's the goal. Sir?
And some of those things that you're treating one thing for be harmful to another.
Absolutely. So even tramadol that I give for back pain will affect the thinking of the patient.
We were talking about last night about broken heart. So if you're numbed out and you're not dealing with that because you're numbed out from pain and physical pain, you're not dealing with that other.
Right. Exactly. So this is where you've got to grasp everything about that patient, that individual, that soldier, and establish the trusting relationship in every way and say, all right, Sergeant, what are we going to do? Here's what we got. What's the best thing for you? That's what I'm talking about. And but I want to also impress upon you, because it's the TBI piece, that it requires us on the other side of that table to appreciate how hard it is for people to grasp the point that you made. If I come to that session sleepy and with a headache and pain, and you're starting to talk to me about what I need to do differently to talk to my wife or talk to my kids or do my course, how likely is it that I'm going to get it? Not much. So then what's going to happen? I'm going to be labeled as not treatment compliant. I'm resisting therapy. Are you kidding? I'm trying as hard as I can. I don't get it. You know, my 8th grader, and I would sit there, I mean, God bless her, her mother had died a little before, and I was trying to teach her algebra. She'd say, Daddy, I don't get it. You know, I said, what don't you get? She says, I don't get it, Daddy. You got it? I don't get it. Just because you are a math whiz, I don't get it. That's the same thing. Interesting, 14, 15 years later, she's doing statistics. She says, oh, I get it now, Daddy. But that's what I'm talking about. Because that's where we gotta rethink what we're going to do with these guys. They got pain, they got this, they got that. They're trying to figure out. Now let's tease that apart. And you know, God bless all the wonderful things we're doing with these manualized therapies and CBT and evidence-based and, you know, gee.
Really?
Really? Exactly. You know, you're in a fog, someone's telling you, well, just follow the manual, you know, just follow the algorithm. Are you, I mean, really? I just want to take the next step. I just want to be able to do You know, I just want to be able to get up in the morning and do what I got to do. We have, go back to the first slide, we've had 2.6 million people, individual Social Security numbers, who've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of them multiple times. Finally, the DoD and the VA are saying probably 30 to 40% of them have got some kind of injury of this kind that is affecting their health. Do the numbers. That's 3/4 to 1 million people. That's a lot of Americans. And if you, just the simple sociologic facts are, if in their immediate circle there are 3 or 4 people who are affected by them, then that's 4 million people. That's 1% of our population. That's significant. There are more homeless vets from Iraq, Afghanistan than we have ever seen from any other war. It affects our whole society. They're going to our jails. It affects their children.
They're dying. That's the word.
And they're dying. 22 a day are committing suicide. And think of the shock wave that comes from that. We've got a responsibility and an obligation to do something about it. That's what you're trying to help us with. That's what we've got to do. The more we learn, that's what I'm trying to get, the more we learn, the better we're going to be able to fulfill what is our mission, our purpose. So it's colorful, it's a beautiful slide. This is what we call a DTI, which is a kind of MRI. This is a normal brain. Not really, but these are the outside of the brain is what we call the gray matter, which all the stuff happens. It doesn't have a covering or an insulation on it. When you go into the brain, it has an insulation called myelin, because all the business here gets transmitted into the body, and when you put the insulation on the myelin on it, the signal goes faster electronically. If you injure the brain, you tear the insulation. There's a reason why people who've had brain injuries walk like this. Because the signal doesn't get to where it needs to go. This is another one of those tools that can be used sometimes to find who's had a TBI. Also not recognized as, quote, standard of care and not acceptable in all courts. Here's what's called a PET, positron emission tomography. So this is the level of glucose metabolism, sort of the energy consumption of the brain, a level of activity. This is a normal brain. This is a severe, what the brain does is after it's injured, it shuts down. I don't know if you've had a concussion. I had a concussion when I was in college 40 years ago. And I felt like sleeping for a good 6-9 months afterwards. Lots of folks, after they've had concussions, feel it is normal to be really sleepy. And it's as if you can't get, even if you've had deep sleep, you can't get enough rest. It is a normal, it may be protective. It may be what the body normally does so that it can heal itself and restore healing functions, which is to kind of shut down. So what if it just shuts down a little bit? can't pay attention. I just had a case referred to me. Lawyer had a concussion in a car accident. He says, I cannot work in my office more than 45 minutes at a time without taking a break, and probably taking a couple short naps. His brain is sleepy. He can't pay attention. This is EEG data that is the electroencephalograph, right? I said that the brain had electrical properties, and it really is kind of, again, it's what door do you walk through? Do you walk through the chemistry door? And look at what the chemistry is and the neurotransmitters? Or do you walk through the electrical door and look at the electrical properties of the brain? That's what the EEG does. It looks at the electrical properties of the brain. And this is what we call quantitative EEG. That is, you can get probably 1 million signals off of a routine EEG and then analyze them mathematically. What we find is in brains of people who've had concussions is that there are certain patterns or losses of patterns. That is, in the healthy brain, there are what we call coherences. That is, there's coordination of what's going on in parts of the brain so that you can work at your best level. In these brains, there's not that coordination. So you can use the EEG to also identify the kinds of problems and where the deficiencies are. I put this up as a way that now you've got some sense of the science, you understand the injury to some extent, you know that it occurs. What does it mean? Sir?
One more question about touch. Is there a correlation between oxygen consumption and glucose levels, since glucose levels are apparently an indicator?
Yes. There is a, so as the glucose level goes down, in the PET scan here, yeah, you probably also, the actual oxygen consumption of the cells at the cellular level also is diminished.
So there's metabolic and constantly intake issues with factors.
Absolutely. So, and really affects sleep. That's the whole idea between this, with sleep apnea, people who kind of at night, one way or another, block off their airway, and their PO2s, that is their blood oxygen levels, go down, and therefore their usual brain metabolism goes down, which also means that the clearance functions. It also leads to, there's a whole group of people, and I'm in that camp, who feel, because of the oxygen issue, that one of the treatments is hyperbaric oxygen. That is to put people in pressurized tanks, not a lot, but less than 2 atmospheres of 100% oxygen. And by putting them in these tanks and being able to expose them to higher levels of oxygen, you're going to be promoting healing that would otherwise take a much longer time to occur, if it's going to occur. And you're also promoting healthy metabolism in the brain. So all that's part of what we do. And that's a lot of things along those lines. I wasn't going to get into treatment, but there are a lot of things along those lines that we feel do that. One of them, it's very simple, that you can always ask your patients, clients, is fish oil. High doses, acutely, sometimes we will recommend people take 15 grams. They'll build up to it, and then they'll taper down to 6 grams every day. Take at least 2 grams of high-grade fish oil. It has positive metabolic effects on the brain tissue and probably promotes healing. And a number of other supplements. But I think, to get back to this issue of what do we do as in the helping professions to somehow kind of get past this idea that there's manualized prescriptive therapies. How do we get past that? Because that's where everyone is going, and that's what's going to get paid for by the insurance companies and so forth. And I propose, I mean, what I do is I just start in a very simple way with the soldier. I don't talk about their symptoms first. I mean, my first, what's your life like? Sergeant, Captain, Colonel, tell me about your life, General. What's going on? What do you do? When you wake up, what's your routine? What's your diet like? I just want to get to know the person. I don't want to start experiencing and engaging this person from the beginning as a patient with a diagnosis. I don't want to walk through that door right at the beginning. I know I'm a doctor. He knows or she knows I'm a doctor. But I miss so much by just putting that white coat on, literally or metaphorically. My first step is to get to know you, what's going on. So I understand, and you understand your life as best as you can. And then we can work together to do what we can to make it a better life for you. Part of making it a better life is going to be to treat diseases and injuries that you've had. And if you've had a TBI, or you feel that you're still having the effects, then we're going to specifically treat that. But we're really going to be thinking about what's the fun part of your life, what's the quality of your relationships, what are you doing in work and school. That's our goal. In the words of the economists, and there's a friend of mine, Michael Porter, who talks about value-based medicine. He's going to put a dollar sign on it. What's the value of what we're doing? Well, the value is, what do you do that's important to you? How well and how much enjoyment and satisfaction are you getting out of it? So I hope what I've done is I've begun to knit this together in a way that is useful to you, but also that you understand and will be able to, and are interested and learn more about really how the brain works, and keep that in your perspective as you're talking to your patients and working with them. With that, I'll answer any more questions, hear comments, sir.
Have you had any conversations with Dr. Livingston at the Hauenstein Institute in Brooklyn, New York, about the diffusion tensor imaging research he's doing on combating with that?
I've not specifically, I've seen his stuff, but I've not spoken to him.
For the folks here in the audience, I'm referring to the Brain Injury Association. I highly encourage you to go on our website. The vast majority of contact tests used in this national research project came from the state of Michigan. We have over 10,000 people employed in the brain injury community. We have over 1,000 certified brain injury experts and called active certified brain injury specialists. I highly encourage you, if you're going to be working with combat injury vets, to educate yourself in the medical model and get the certifications to be experts in. Okay? So you can go right on the Brain Injury Association Michigan. We're the largest organization in the nation.
That's great. I'm glad you brought it, because I think there's on the front lines, there's just a lot of things that you can do. I guess you all have got listed all the various cognitive rehab tools and supplements and all that. I mean, there's just an everyday conversation. There's a host of sort of effort, support that you can give in your work with them. Yes, ma'am.
How much do you find that thyroid function comes into play when you're evaluating and treating for PTSD?
That's a great question. A lot. I test all my patients for thyroid, other sex hormones, other adrenal hormones. I look for infection because sometimes they'll have chronic infections that have not been identified. All this area, what I'm telling you is all kind of up for grabs, controversial. And so, for example, the thyroid, traditionally, classically, internists or endocrinologists will do a thyroid test. They'll take the lab values, and there's, I think, a pretty good range there. If you're not either high or low, they won't treat you. I think that's not informed, okay? So I don't want to get sued here in Michigan, but I don't have a license. I think because a lot of, first of all, imagine all the center, the signal center for all that stuff, right? The control site for all your hormonal stuff is in the brain. So if I ding your brain, is it not going to affect the way your hormones and your function, your endocrine functioning? Obviously it's going to affect. We know that with severe brain injuries, moderately severe brain injuries, people who've gone into coma, that they become hypothyroid. And they have to be treated. So we know that. What if you've got a chronic, as they say, mild TBI, but it's chronic? Is it not likely that maybe your thyroid function is suppressed? So I will, with fully informed consent, advise the patient that I think we need to boost your thyroid functioning. Sir?
As a non-medical person, there's the three axes, the thyroid, the adrenal. What are the three hormonal axes that gets triggered by the PTSD and the TBI? There's the pituitary, there's
the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So but it all in one way or another really flows through the adrenal gland, and you'll have high sympathetic functioning. So here's the other non-traditional treatment that we'll sometimes use both with TBIs, and I think it's got some good science to it, and it's getting a little bit more traction. There is a anesthesiologist, pain specialist in Chicago, and I've watched him do this, and I've sent him patients who, because of their PTSD, are just like this all the time, literally. I mean, you can just see it in them. They're wired. It's making their headaches worse. It's making their pain worse. They're just at a high sympathetic functioning. And you can do hypnosis, and you can give them sometimes benzodiazepine tranquilizers, and you can give them anticonvulsants. You can do a lot. You can relaxation, get them to exercise, but they just can't reset their sympathetic nervous system. He does what's called a stellate ganglion block. That is, it's a ganglion here that really is the sort of the transmission, sort of the center for all your sympathetic nervous activity, and he essentially anesthetizes it and resets the sympathetic nervous system. And I've watched it have an amazing effect on patients. And if they've got headaches, it really helps them with their headaches as well. Well, I'm getting the hook. Thank you. All right, one more. All right. Sir, ma'am.
I just recently became familiar with a case of a young soldier with some TBI, and he was diagnosed with sleep apnea, but they have found that the center, it's not the obstruction thing, it's in the brain center.
Right.
Is that very common, and what's the typical treatment?
That's why I showed you that slide about sleep, so that the brain itself, the center for the brain itself, has been injured as part of the TBI. So, and I also see that, interestingly, in Lyme disease, right? Because Lyme and what we call the other family of tick-borne infections. So Lyme disease is a cousin of syphilis, and as you know, syphilis would hit the nervous system, and it would affect this sleep center? With a wing and a prayer. You know, I mean, we will, if it's just because of the TBI, then we will do the hyperbaric oxygen, which I have to again state that is not an approved treatment, not considered standard of care, but your doctor can give it to you. You have to pay for it. We'll treat the thyroid, because if they've got a central problem like that, then their whole axis is affected. So we'll treat sometimes the manifestations of it. We'll try and treat the brain with hyperbaric. Sir?
Here in Grand Rapids at the Spectrum Sleep Center, Dr. Coles, young psychiatrist, did his residency at the, he went to Dartmouth and did his residency psychiatrically at the VA Center across the street, and he's a specialist with PTSD and sleep, and he's treating over 30 of my PTSD vets for sleep apnea. And he, the brain, and he collaborates with the VA and helps them get off some of the medications that are causing, exacerbating the problem. Right. So Dr. Coles at the Spectrum Sleep Center.
Does the military provide that treatment?
No.
These are guys that are on TRICARE or Medicare or
Right.
private sector, the VA won't pay for it.
Right, right. These are all alternative therapies that have not passed the screen.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Oh, thanks.
Hauenstein Center tote bag.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. It's been such a pleasure. Really, thank you so much. Herm, thanks, buddy.
You do a great job as usual, Steve. And I know more about my brain than I did before I got here. I'm not sure I enjoyed all that. We're going to take about a 15-minute break, and then we're going to have the last panel. And I hope you'll stay around for that, and then we'll close the session, and we'll be out here at 5. Thank you. Well, it's good to see all of you back from lunch. Usually have some people that drop out of lunch, and so we're glad you came back. And it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Steve Xenakis. And Steve and I were puppies together in the Pentagon. He was a young psychiatrist, and I was a baby chaplain. And we got to know each other very well, and we have kept in contact over the years. He's a retired brigadier general, and he's done a tremendous amount of work for the mental health community in the United States Army, and also in the Department of Defense, because he has been the advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and as well as he's now advising the Vice President as they work on some mental health issues in the law. And Steve has been just a delight to know. He's taught me a lot of things, and one is not to introduce him too long, because that eats into his time to speak. And this is his first time in Michigan, in Grand Rapids, and so I hope you'll give him a warm Michigan welcome. Dr. Steve Xenakis.